Ultimately, the source of this silt and clay, or suspended sediment in general, is erosion, and the more erosion there is in the watershed, the more sediment there's going to be in the stream. In other words, then the more suspended load or muddy water you're going to see after rains, and then when that water slows down in either pools or as the stream drops, that sediment is going to be deposited and create the sedimentation siltation impairment that's been recognized. In the Dry Creek watershed, removal of vegetation is the big problem. That may be through household or residential construction, or particularly in the case of our study period, it was 519 construction. So all that sediment from the bare ground washed into the streams at Morgan Fork and then flowed into Dry Creek. Plowing and clearing of land and other agricultural practices also tend to cause considerable erosion, especially if the vegetation isn't reestablished very quickly. Logging practices can also cause problems, especially if they don't follow the master logging sort of training BMPs that should be used during logging practices. Most folks in the watershed tend to like to mow their grass right up to the stream bank, and they don't like a bunch of young trees or brush along the stream banks, either because they just don't like the way it looks or they're afraid the snakes might be in the bushes and get after their kids. But this causes a problem. When you remove all the vegetation along the banks, they become more unstable and actually erode faster. Another problem in the watershed is alteration of the channel, either by the Department of Transportation or by the county or by citizens themselves. Typically what happens is people will straighten the channel out, maybe armor the banks, and in effect make the stream both straighter and smoother bottomed, and both of those things have a tendency to increase the flow velocity. While further downstream, that faster moving water is going to cause greater erosion. We also have fairly widespread gravel mining in the watershed, and the removal of those gravel bars actually also makes the bottom smoother and allows the water to speed up and therefore increases bank erosion. So all of these are issues within the Dry Creek watershed. So this is an example of one of the areas where bare ground is eroding fairly rapidly. This particular area has been bare for quite some time, even a few years actually, and there's never really been any sort of attempt to put too much in the way of protections on there to keep the grass seed from washing away, and the vegetation's just never really taken hold. And you can see that there are gullies in the bank up by the tree line, so that indicates that erosion is indeed occurring, and that muddy water will wash over here during rains, end up in the ditches, and eventually into the culverts and into the stream, polluting Dry Creek. This is the unfortunate example of the 519 construction project that was going on. There is a complete lack of erosion protection and sediment controls that are required by state regulations of these Department of Transportation projects, but you don't see any of the black silt fencing, you don't see any of the check dams made out of the limestone riprap to slow this water down. And because of the lack of these protections, the sediment loads on Dry Creek were pretty severe downstream of where Morgan Fork comes in. Remember, Morgan Fork is the small stream that runs parallel to 519, so as Morgan Fork was polluted by all this runoff, it would end up in Dry Creek near one of our downstream sites there, not too far from the Clearfield Post Office. This remained the case, this lack of protection remained the case during 519 construction until one of the citizens in the Dry Creek watershed complained to the Division of Water, and they came out and had a look around, did an inspection, and it was after that point that the construction contractor began to install some rather ineffective controls, but nonetheless a few did appear after this complaint. This is a series of photographs of probably one of the worst problems in the watershed as far as sediment supply and erosion goes, and that is bank erosion. Most of the streams in the watershed are entrenched, which means they have these vertical banks, and we know they're eroding rapidly. You can see the leaning trees as well as the undermined tree root balls. So the fact that this is occurring is not lost on the residents of the watershed either, because they've been trying to stabilize this by using big slabs of concrete or whatever they have to try to prevent this erosion. So what we've had to do is to try to get an idea of how rapidly this occurs, and to also get an idea of how much of the sediment is actually coming from bank erosion. So what we've done to get a handle on these bank erosion rates is to drive steel rebar pins in certain locations at banks that we want to measure. So under the transit in this photograph, there's a steel rebar pin like a surveyor would use, and there's another pin up behind the young man's head, the guy on the ladder. There's another pin up there. Now, since those pins are long enough to be driven below the frost line, they don't move, so we know exactly where we measure these channels. So we'll measure it one time and then come out months, even years later, and measure it again. And by measuring and remeasuring these locations, we get a sense of how the channel is changing its shape and how quickly it's eroding. This is a pretty severely eroding bank on Sugar Branch, not that far above where the Tin Wolf Inn is, and near a little bridge that crosses Sugar Branch. It's about, I don't know, 12, 15 feet tall and continues to get taller every day. Based on field data collected as in the previous slide, we draw graphs that look like this, where there is one curve for one part of the year and another curve for another part of the year. And we'll do this for many years, but this just shows the same location with a few months in between. The yellow line on the right-hand side of the diagram is to the right of the red line. That means that anywhere from 2 to about 4 feet of that tall bank that the young man was standing by has eroded in that period of time. In the center of the channel, the yellow line is above the red line. That represents a new gravel bar that formed from bank material that was derived from further upstream. So those gravel bars sit on the bottom, but they don't really just sit there. They're actually moving slowly downstream, whereas the muddy sediment, the silt and clay and a little bit of sand, move rapidly downstream and create that muddiness in the water that we usually see. Based on this and other measurements in a 170-foot long set of banks right along this location, we figured out that it's about 900,000 pounds of sediment per year being derived from this one location alone. About half of that is suspended sediment, the muddiness, and about half is gravel. Of course, this gravel is an attractive target for the gravel miners, and they'll come in and scoop it all up, which accelerates the velocity of the water and creates even greater erosion. So it's a pretty severe problem in this one location, and even if 5% of the banks in the Dry Creek watershed are eroding anywhere near this badly, it accounts for millions and millions of pounds of sediment, which probably means that most of the sediment in the watershed is being derived from bank erosion. We haven't had but so much success convincing people that a little mud in the water is much of an issue. Most people just don't see where that's particularly a problem, even though it does cause many problems. But it's not as difficult to convince people that having your yard disappear is a problem. This is a series of diagrams and photographs from a textbook that we tend to use, and it's copyrighted material, but nonetheless. What it shows in the little block diagram to the left of the drawing of the meandering stream is that high erosion tends to occur on the outer banks of these curves in the stream, whereas on the insides of these banks you tend to get this gravel bar deposition. The two old black and white photographs to the right, which were taken in January 1965 and in March 1965, give you a sense of just how rapidly this problem can occur. So you'll notice in the upper photograph from January 1965 that the garage or the corner of the house is about 10 to 15 feet away from the eroding bank, but a mere 3 months later the garage is 3 or 4 feet of garage is literally hanging over the bank, where erosion has worked its way right up under the shed. So people on Dry Creek are seeing these same sorts of things, and they've been trying to stabilize the banks themselves in various ways. And we know this is a problem. So what we're hoping to accomplish here is to maybe get more folks to voluntarily maybe reintroduce vegetation to the banks, try to plant more vegetation there, to not mow right up to the edge of the banks. And if that doesn't work, then we may have to try to find funding for some more hardscape sorts of things like the gabion baskets that you see near the Ravenswood Bridge. And by doing the, hopefully primarily through revegetation and perhaps hardscape, we can get these bank erosion rates under control. People won't be losing their property quite so quickly, and the amount of sediment in the stream will decrease, and therefore we can hopefully take care of some of this settling or siltation problem that's smothering these spawning beds and causing the problems with life in the stream up there. So that's our goal ultimately, is to try to get some of these practices in place and hopefully improve things. Thank you.